Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're watching or listening. My name is Caleb Glick. I'm a lawyer here in the great state of Texas with the Calhoun School of Law to bring you a lot of information plenty of bad folks would rather you not have. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we'll provide another installation to our Anti-Federalist Papers series going on number 23. So if you haven't gone back and watched 1 through 22, I would highly encourage you to do so because understanding the Anti-Federalist Papers, in addition to the Federalist Papers, is going to provide you a very well-rounded, advantageous understanding of the U.S. Constitution, and understanding the U.S. Constitution is absolutely necessary if you intend to combat any sort of lawfare waged against you, your loved ones, or your hard-earned property. So let's go ahead and jump on over to the Anti-Federalist Papers. There are multiple institutions from which you can get a copy, both paper and digital, of the Anti-Federalist Papers. Go ahead and get both in case you can't access one or the other for whatever infinite number of reasons. While you're at it, if you haven't already, go ahead and get a copy of the Federalist Papers so you can join us in comparing and contrasting the arguments for and against ratifying the U.S. Constitution. Excellent. So, number 23 is titled Certain Powers Necessary for the Common Defense and should be limited. In Federalist number 23, Alexander Hamilton spoke of the necessity for an energetic government. Brutus replied. Brutus wrote quite a few of these papers. Taken from the 7th and 8th essays of Brutus in the New York Journal, January 3rd and 10th, 1788, he says this. And by the way, a lot of the Anti-Federalists used aliases and pseudonyms because of the legitimate threat, direct threat from the Federalists. Hamilton at one point said, "You're going to comply, states, or you're going to die." Ultimately, that wish came to fruition, that demand came to fruition during Mr. Washington's administration with a number of his actions, including things like the Whiskey Rebellion. Anyway, here's what Brutus had to say. In a confederated government, where the powers are divided between the general and the state government, it is essential that the revenues of the country, without which no government can exist, should be divided between them, and so apportioned to each as to answer their respective exigencies, as far as human wisdom can effect such a division and apportionment. No such allotment is made in this Constitution, but every source of revenue is under the control of Congress. It therefore follows that if this system is intended to be a complex and not a simple, a confederate and not an entire consolidated government, it contains in it the sure seeds of its own dissolution. One of two things must happen. Either the new Constitution will become a mere nudum pactum, great Latin phrase, I suggest all of you look it up right now, and all the authority of the rulers under it be cried down, as has happened to the present Confederacy. Or the authority of the individual states will be totally supplanted, and they will retain the mere form without any of the powers of government. Highlight that sentence. That could not be any truer. When election season comes around, are you even aware of state elections? Do you know who your state legislators are? Do you know who your state governor is? Do you know who the justices on your state's Supreme Court are? Do you have a bifurcated judicial system like Texas, where we have a highest court for criminal complaints and then for criminal charges, and then a highest court for civil matters? Point being, you know who the president of the U.S. is, but do you know who the governing officials are for your state governments? The one or the other of these issues, I think this new government, if it is adopted, will advance with great celerity. It is said, I know, that such a separation of the sources of revenue cannot be made without endangering the public safety, unless, says a writer, Alexander Hamilton, it can be shown that the circumstances which may affect the public safety are reducible within certain determinate limits. Unless the contrary of this position can be fairly and rationally disputed, it must be admitted as a necessary consequence that there can be no limitation of that authority which is to provide for the defense and protection of the community. Federalist number 23. The pretended demonstration of this writer will instantly vanish when it is considered that the protection and defense of the community is not intended to be entrusted solely into the hands of the general government, and by his own confession it ought not to be. He confessed that. It is true this system commits to the general government the protection and defense of the community against foreign force and invasion, against piracies and felonies on the high seas, and against insurrection among ourselves. They are also authorized to provide for the administration of justice in certain matters of a general concern, and in some that I think are not so. But it ought to be left to the state governments to provide for the protection and defense of the citizen against the hand of private violence and the wrongs done or attempted by individuals to each other. Protection and defense against the murderer, the robber, the thief, the cheat, and the unjust person is to be derived from the respective state governments. The just way of reasoning, therefore, on this subject is this: the general government is to provide for the protection and defense of the community against foreign attacks, etc. They therefore ought to have authority sufficient to effect this, so far as is consistent with the providing for our internal protection and defense. The state governments are entrusted with the care of administering justice among its citizens and the management of other internal concerns. They ought therefore to retain power adequate to that end. The preservation of internal peace and good order, and the due administration of law and justice, ought to be the first care of every government. The happiness of a people depends infinitely more on this than it does upon all that glory and respect which nations acquire by the most brilliant martial achievements. And I believe history will furnish but few examples of nations who have duly attended to these, who have been subdued by foreign invaders. If a proper respect and submission to the laws prevailed over all orders of men in our country, and if a spirit of public and private justice, economy, and industry influenced the people, we need not be under any apprehensions, but what they would be ready to repel any invasion that might be made on the country. And more than this, I would not wish from them. A defensive war is the only one I think justifiable. I like that. Not looking to make a global empire. We do not want conquest. We do not want global empire. Defensive wars are those only justifiable. If you remember, Thomas Jefferson during his presidency provided the perfect example of that with the Barbary Wars. He didn't go attacking, he only defended. He retaliated, he did not instigate. Why he's definitely among the ranks, if not the best, the presidents to have ever served as U.S. president. Him, Calvin Coolidge, Grover Cleveland. Thomas Jefferson was, I would argue, probably the best president the U.S. has ever had. I do not make these observations to prove that a government ought not to be authorized to provide for the protection and defense of a country against external enemies, but to show that this is not the most important, much less the only object of their care. The European governments are almost all of them framed and administered with a view to arms and war as that in which their chief glory consists. They mistake the end of government. It was designed to save men's lives, not to destroy them. Good point. We ought to furnish the world with an example of a great people who in their civil institutions hold chiefly in view the attainment of virtue and happiness among ourselves. Isolationism. Let the monarchs in Europe share among them the glory of depopulating countries. Quite the sophisticated way of saying let them kill each other. In butchering thousands of their innocent citizens to revenge private quarrels or to punish an insult offered to a wife, a mistress, or a favorite. Oh, me. It's always a joy reading Brutus's papers. I envy them not the honor, and I pray heaven this country may never be ambitious of it. The Tsar Peter the Great acquired great glory by his arms, but all this was nothing compared with the true glory which he obtained by civilizing his rude and barbarous subjects, diffusing among them knowledge, and establishing and cultivating the arts of life. By the former he desolated countries, and drenched the earth with human blood. By the latter he softened the ferocious nature of his people, and pointed them to the means of human happiness. The most important end of government, then, is the proper direction of its internal police and economy. This is the province of the state governments, and it is evident, and is indeed admitted, that these ought to be under their control. It is not then preposterous, and in the highest degree absurd, when the state governments are vested with powers so essential to the peace and good order of society, to take from them the means of their own preservation. The idea that the powers of Congress in respect to revenue ought to be unlimited because the circumstances which may affect the public safety are not reducible to certain determinate limits is novel as it relates to the government of the United States. The inconveniencies which resulted from the feebleness of the present Confederation was discerned and felt soon after its adoption. It was soon discovered that a power to require money without either the authority or means to enforce a collection of it could not be relied upon either to provide for the common defense, discharge the national debt, or for support of government. Congress, therefore, as early as February 1781, recommended to the states to invest them with a power to levy an impost of 5% ad valorem on all imported goods, as a fund to be appropriated to discharge the debts already contracted, or which should hereafter be contracted for the support of the war, to be continued until the debts should be fully and finally discharged. There is not the most distant idea held out in this act that an unlimited power to collect taxes, duties, and excises was necessary to be vested in the United States, and yet this was a time of the most pressing danger and distress. The idea then was that if certain definite funds were assigned to the Union, which were certain in their natures, productive, and easy of collection, it would enable them to answer their engagements and provide for their defense, and the impost of 5% was fixed upon for the purpose. This same subject was revived in the winter and spring of 1783, and after a long consideration of the subject, many schemes were proposed. The result was a recommendation of the revenue system of April 1783. This system does not suggest an idea that it was necessary to grant the United States unlimited authority in matters of revenue. A variety of amendments were proposed to this system, some of which are upon the journals of Congress, but it does not appear that any of them propose to invest the general government with discretionary power to raise money. On the contrary, all of them limit them to certain definite objects and fix the bounds over which they could not pass. This recommendation was passed at the conclusion of the war and was founded on an estimate of the whole national debt. It was computed that $1,500,000 of dollars in addition to the impost was a sufficient sum to pay the annual interest of the debt and gradually to abolish the principal. Events have proved that their estimate was sufficiently liberal, as the domestic debt appears upon its being adjusted to be less than it was computed. So Hamilton, when he was talking about the debts from France, and there was another country he had mentioned, but these debts that the U.S. had supposedly contracted were way over exaggerated, and they were intentionally exaggerated to garner money, to garner wealth, to garner resources, the general government. And since this period is a considerable portion of the principal of domestic debt has been discharged by the sale of the Western lands, it has been constantly urged by Congress and by individuals ever since until lately that had this revenue been appropriated by the states as it was recommended, it would have been adequate to every exigency of the Union. Now, indeed, it is insisted that all the treasurers of the country are to be under the control of that body, whom we are to appoint to provide for our protection and defense against foreign enemies. The debts of the several states and the support of the governments of them are to trust to fortune and accident. If the Union should not have occasion for all the money they can raise, they will leave a portion for the state, but this must be a matter of mere grace and favor. Doctrines like these would not have been listened to by any state in the Union at a time when we were pressed on every side by a powerful enemy and were called upon to make greater exertions than we have any reason to expect we shall ever be again. Go ahead and highlight that. This idea of providing unlimited power to the Congress to levy taxes or collect resources would have been laughed out of the theater during the American Revolution. I may be asked to point out the sources from which the general government could derive a sufficient revenue to answer the demands of the Union. There is one source of revenue, which it is agreed the general government ought to have the sole control of. This is an impost upon all goods imported from foreign countries, because it's a federally protected activity. This would, of itself, be very productive, and would be collected with ease and certainty, right at the port, right as the transaction's being made. It will be a fund, too, constantly increasing, for our commerce will grow with the productions of the country, and these, together with our consumption of foreign goods, will increase with our population. Exactly. It is said that the impost will not produce a sufficient sum to satisfy the demands of the general government. Perhaps it would not. My own opinion is that the objects from which the general government should have authority to raise a revenue should be of such a nature that the tax should be raised by simple laws, with few officers, with certainty and expedition, and with the least interference with the internal police of the states. Of this nature is the impost on imported goods. and it appears to me that a duty on exports would also be of this nature, again, because it's federally facilitated. Therefore, for aught I can discover, this would be the best source of revenue to grant the general government. I know neither the Congress nor the state legislatures will have authority under the new Constitution to raise revenue in this way, but I cannot perceive the reason of the restriction. It appears to me evident that a tax on articles exported would be as nearly equal as any that we can expect to lay, and it certainly would be collected with more ease and less expense than any direct tax. I do not, however, contend for this mode. It may be liable to well-founded objections that have not occurred to me. But this I do contend for, that some mode is practicable, and that limits must be marked between the general government and the states on this head, or if they be not, either the Congress in the exercise of this power will deprive the state legislatures of the means of their existence, or the states, by resisting the constitutional authority of the general government, will render it nugatory. The next powers vested by this Constitution in the general government which we shall consider are those which authorize them to, quote, borrow money on the credit of the United States, and to raise and support armies. I take these two together and connect them with the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, because their extent and the danger that will raise from the exercise of these powers cannot be fully understood unless they are viewed in relation to each other. And remember, even James Madison in the Federalist Papers, I think it was number 45, said that standing armies are the worst, are the most certain enemy of liberty, of freedoms. They are the first tool used by tyrants, dictators, and authoritarians to subvert and subjugate the citizenry. The power to borrow money is general and unlimited, and the clause so often before referred to authorizes the passing of any laws proper and necessary to carry this into execution. Under this authority, Congress may mortgage any or all the revenues of the Union as a fund to loan money upon, and it is probable in this way they may borrow of foreign nations a principal sum, the interest of which will be equal to the annual revenues of the country. But this means they may create a national debt so large as to exceed the ability of the country ever to sink. I can scarcely contemplate a greater calamity that could befall this country than to be loaded with a debt exceeding their ability ever to discharge. Doesn't that sound familiar? If this be a just remark, it is unwise and improvident to vest in the general government a power to borrow at discretion without any limitation or restriction. It may possibly happen that the safety and welfare of the country may require that money be borrowed, and it is proper when such a necessity arises that the power should be exercised by the general government. But it certainly ought never to be exercised but on the most urgent occasions, and then we should not borrow of foreigners if we could possibly avoid it. The Constitution should therefore have so restricted the exercise of this power as to have rendered it very difficult for the government to practice it. The present Confederation requires the assent of 9 states to exercise this, and a number of other important powers of the Confederacy. It would certainly have been a wise provision in this Constitution to have made it necessary that 2/3 of the members should assent to borrowing money. When the necessity was indispensable, this assent would always be given, and in no other cause ought it to be. If the tax really is necessary, you won't have to coerce the states to enforce the collection of it. The power to raise armies is indefinite and unlimited, and authorizes the raising of forces as well in peace as in war. Whether the clause which empowers the Congress to pass all laws which are proper and necessary to carry this into execution will not authorize them to impress men for the army is a question well worthy of consideration. If the general legislature deem it for the general welfare to raise a body of troops, and they cannot be procured by voluntary enlistments, it seems evident that it will be proper and necessary to effect it, that men be impressed from the militia to make up the deficiency. I like that sentence. Same principle with the taxation. If the government is having to enforce it, if coercion is required to instill or implement the practice, the citizens don't want it. The states don't want it. The Union was formed for the benefit of the states. The moment that principle is contradicted by either party, state or general government, the states need to leave the Union. These powers taken in connection amount to this, that the general government have unlimited authority and control over all the wealth and all the force of the Union. The advocates for this scheme would favor the world with a new discovery if they would show what kind of freedom or independency is left to the state governments when they cannot command any part of the property or of the force of the country, but at the will of the Congress. It seems to me as absurd as it would be to say that I was free and independent when I had conveyed all my property to another, and was tenant to him, and had beside given an indenture of myself to serve him during life. What a way to close such a strong and direct message. Now, if you have any questions about what Mr. Brutus was saying there in 23, maybe questions about what was said in the previous papers, or there's a topic you'd like me to cover in a future lecture, go ahead and post it down in the comments, because the entire purpose of the Calhoun School of Law is to provide you with the necessary skills and information to combat any sort of lawfare that will be waged against you, your loved ones, or your hard-earned property. So please, if you have any questions at all, go ahead and post them down in the comments. Excellent. So my name is Caleb Glick. I'm a lawyer here in the great state of Texas with the Calhoun School of Law to bring you a lot of information that plenty of bad folks would rather you not have. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and if not, while you're down in the comments, go ahead and let me know how I can do better so I can best serve that purpose of helping you. I hope you'll have a wonderful day, and I'm not sure what the topic for the next lecture is going to be, but I'll do my best to make it as informative and entertaining as this one, if not more so. Regardless of the topic of the next lecture, until I see y'all then, I bid you all farewell.